There's a pretty one, Ulysses. There it is.
Hello, BookTube. I'm Sean Breathes Books. Welcome back to my channel and another Friday Reads. I'm withholding some fabulous news, so stay tuned for that. But I don't have a whole lot to say otherwise, except I have a great biblioadventure to tell you about. It was an online biblioadventure, and I haven't finished any books, and I have an absolutely stupendous mystery guest for you. With that outline of the proceedings, let's dive in. But I need to begin this with a few comments on what's happening in the world. I have been struggling to find something interesting or insightful to say about what Trump is doing to the world. I am consuming the news. I have resubscribed to all my podcasts and newspapers. I'm not losing sleep over it yet, but that will probably come. I think we're witnessing one of the most disastrous transitions in geopolitical history, at least in the last 700 years. The Canadian-U.S. relationship is fractured for a century at least. I have never seen my country and its people, even a sizable number of indigenous voices, express hatred and revulsion towards Trump that is bleeding into a hatred of the country as a whole. And that is going to have severe economic and cultural and interpersonal consequences. And I don't think it's going to change for many decades. And I'm just sick about Ukraine, the betrayal that Trump is perpetrating on that brave nation. Anyway, moving on. I took part in, I always struggle with the verb. It was a Zoom literary reading. I don't go to very many of those anymore. They became such an important part of my life during the lockdown phase of the pandemic. But this one was promoted by one of the readers, Barb Howard, a real big friend of this channel, Calgary novelist. And she was one of the readers. There was three. She's the most maybe well-known, at least to me. I hadn't heard of the other two. And Barb read from her most recent novella, Happy Sands. She just brought it all back to me. This is one of the few books I've read twice in the same year. Just a wonderful comic novel about an Alberta family that goes for their annual trip to a rundown beach lakeside resort. And the mom is a bit of a hard drinker and a massage therapist. There's a cast of characters that come back year after year. It's just an absolute delight. Barb read from it so well, it gives me another opportunity to recommend this novel, published in 2021. I'll put links to my chats. I had at least one long chat with Barb about Happy Sands. That was a joy. Also joyous was the fact that I got to meet or hear readings from two writers who were unknown to me. The second reader was Helena Katz. She has published a whole bunch of books, nonfiction. One of them is on the Mad Trapper, which is a pretty important figure in Northern Canadian history. I read a book about him, might have been the one that she wrote when I was about 14. Don't remember much about it. She's also written at least two books on wrongful convictions in Canada. She's now working on a collection of essays, which has not yet been published, and she read from one of those. Her life story is fascinating. About 20 years ago, she left her native Montreal and moved to Northern Canada, Fort Smith in the Northwest Territories. With her husband, her partner, they are raising alpacas. And one of the essays she read from was about that experience. There's a link to what may be an earlier version of that I found that I'll link in the show notes. And she is living and doing all this fabulous stuff and writing with a visual impairment. She talked about that, and I assume some of the essays will be about that as well. She was fascinating. And the third and final reader was also from Canada's north, the poet Dawn Macdonald. She was amazing. Her most recent poetry collection is called Northerny. It's not a lovely adjective. She lives in Whitehorse. She's a poet and researcher. I'll put a link to an article about her on the CBC website that includes a 15-minute audio interview on CBC Radio's The Next Chapter. This collection of poetry is about living in and growing up in the North. I'm going to read you a poem that I found online. It sounds an awful lot like one of the ones she read. She may have read this one, but it's a wonderful poem I'm going to read to you. She grew up in a cabin near Whitehorse with no running water or electricity, and she's my age or younger, so she's had an interesting life. Here is the poem that I found online. I'll put a link to it. It is included in Northerny. It's called A Boring Poem. I'm not so interested in writing any northern nature Yukoner poems about the northern lights and my trusty sled dog see your breath adventure. But all my poems turn out to have animals in them because that's where I'm. And I do share 50% of my DNA with a banana. So I don't want to hear any more about how I'm bad at sharing just because I'm an only child and everybody's bad at assumptions. Well, at the end of the day, I was born here at the end of the day in a thunderstorm of anesthesia and incubation. An animal purred into that room, nipped a neat umbilical, wolfed my head right out of the womb. That's its breath on the window page, blurring. It makes a real hot meat view. I don't understand everything about that poem, but I love it nonetheless. It wasn't completely mystifying, but I didn't quite understand the real hot meat view. If you did, please leave a comment and explain it to me. And I'm so curious by that phrase, because that's where I'm. And then then we have the conjunction and. So I think, it just sounds so weird to me that it's not because that's where I am. Anybody have another take or more? Lindy, help me out. Explicate, please. I loved it. So I had a really interesting evening watching that. All right, I have been dying to get this particular mystery guest interview to you. I taped it a couple weeks ago because the author's new novel is launching now, and they had more time a couple weeks ago than they do now. And we just clicked. Here it is. And this week's mystery guest is the Irish writer, Patrick Holloway, joining us from Cork in Ireland. Patrick, welcome.
Thank you, Sean. Delighted to be here.
Patrick's debut novel, The Language of Remembering, is coming out later in February, and we're here to talk about it. And I'm a big fan and supporter of Epoch Press, which is publishing The Language of Remembering. Patrick, this book, what I've read of what it's all about, it sounds like such a Sean book. Please tell us more about it.
Good. Yeah. The Language of Remembering, as you said, Epoch are amazing, and they've been really amazing since the start of this process. So The Language of Remembering, there's two narrators, first of all. So it's a split narration. So there's a narrator from then and a narrator from now. And it opens with now, which is Oisín. So Oisín has moved back to Ireland from Brazil to take care of his mum, who has early onset Alzheimer's. So among other things that happened to him during his chapters, he's trying to really connect with his past and connect with his mum. And the worse she gets, basically, the more that this distance is growing between them, and their relationship is actually getting worse. So he starts to take evening classes in Irish to try and connect with her again. So his narration follows that, among other things, of moving back to Ireland, maybe this almost reverse culture shock, but trying to fit back into maybe who he once was, trying to understand who he is now and maybe who he could be. And then the other narrator is Bridget, and her narration is in the early 80s in rural Cork, and she gets pregnant out of wedlock. So you have that kind of stigma attached to it. And her narration, basically, again, it's about identity. It's about shredding maybe the identity that she thought she was going to have, the person she thought she was going to be, and getting pregnant, keeping the baby. And it's like that 9-month period that we follow Bridget. And obviously Bridget is the mother of Oisín in the later chapters. So they connect on many levels, and their stories interlap throughout.
That sounds amazing. Now, if you didn't say, roughly how old is your protagonist when he comes back from Brazil, and how long had he been there?
So Oisín had been there for a decade, and he comes back and he's mid-30s. So he comes back with his wife, Helena, and he has a daughter called Eilish. So Eilish is 3 or 4 when they get back. And then Bridget, in her chapters, she's 17. So she's like at the end of school. Here we call the leaving cert. So she's in the year to do the leaving cert, which she obviously she doesn't do it in the end because she gets pregnant.
And everything I know about you, I learned about 5 minutes ago. And I know that you lived in Brazil as well. You don't have to get into personal stuff about how autobiographical this is, but it sounds like at least in some part it is.
Yeah, it's not actually autobiographical. I did my PhD over in Brazil and in creative writing and literary theory. And one of the strands of my research was about language and identity and how we change through language. also about memory and identity. So it all kind of relates around this identity. And I suppose I wanted both of the main characters to be questioning their own identities, their identities of the past, their identities of the now, and the whole idea of the language. So obviously Bridget's language is being taken away from her, a sense of her identity. And Oisín is discovering her again through Irish, which is another identity that he had never known because she was younger when she spoke Irish. He could have come back from anywhere. I know you lived in Japan. He could have come back from Japan. It's not where he came back from. It's the fact of coming back from somewhere else and bringing this new identity with him. The person he was there in Brazil is important in relation to the story because his narration is often the second person. So it's you. I chose that narration specifically because I do think that there's a disconnect between who he is and what he remembers. He almost feels like he's not himself entirely throughout the book. And he's really discovering who he is. And I suppose a lot of that comes about memory as well. There's repressed memories that he's coming to terms with moving back. It's not very plot heavy. It's very character driven. But I suppose it's heightened in the terms that he's back to where he once was. And that kind of brings up so much from the past.
You had me at character driven, and I've decided that whether you have time or not, I think this needs to be a 2-hour chat. I have so many questions. Did you do your PhD in Portuguese or English over there?
Portuguese, yeah. So I wrote my thesis
you
in
are
Portuguese.
Obviously fluent in Portuguese. Oh my gosh.
Yeah, I suppose I found the writing aspect of Portuguese easier. Like I am fluent, and obviously my wife is Brazilian and I have 2 daughters. And we try to speak as much Portuguese as we can at home. My wife is better. She speaks much more Portuguese, but I suppose it was our contact language for a very long time and with the kids. But yeah, taking on the PhD was a bit mad, to be honest. At one point, there were so many points during the PhD. I was like, what the fuck have I done? What am I doing? I think there were 6 months that I didn't open my laptop. I just couldn't get, it was really difficult. So it was one of my proudest moments probably was actually getting through writing a thesis, and I wrote a book of poetry, a bilingual book of poetry at the time there. So yeah, it was a trek to get to the end, but I'm happy I got there.
That's amazing. And do you speak Irish or are you learning Irish?
I don't. I spoke Irish for school, but it was my weakest subject. And it's really like unfortunate that at that time I was a teenager and I didn't care about school and I was too, like whatever. And Irish just wasn't something I was naturally good at. So therefore, growing up a lot, if I wasn't naturally good at something, I would find what I was good at and go that way. So I did leave Irish to the side. And when I had this premise for the book, it started out as a short story in Brazil. I had this really like ideological scenario that I moved back to Ireland and I do what Oisín does and I take the evening classes. And that was really like something I wanted to do. But obviously I moved back in the middle of a pandemic, so that was impossible. And then when the pandemic was finishing, like I had to find a job and I had trying to get a mortgage and like life just got in the way. But it was something I really actually wanted to do. And there is a scene in the book that he's in the Irish class and language fails him once again. And I did have help with the bits of dialogue and some words in Irish. Like you don't need to understand Irish to understand what's happening. There's a bit of Portuguese in it. You don't need to understand Portuguese to understand what's happening. The context gives it. But I did have to get help with, I have a great writer friend, a poet, and she speaks fluent Irish, and she did help me with the Irish. And a few times she was like, what did you mean to say here? And I was like, I was then worse than I thought I was.
That is so interesting. I just have to ask you, are you familiar with the British novelist Margiad Evans from the 1930s and 40s, maybe 20s and 30s? She was English, but she lived on the Welsh border in the Welsh borderlands, and all of her novels were set in Wales. And the one in particular that I think you would be fascinated by is called Country Dance, 1932. It's a novella. And there's a scene in there, the Welsh mother of the protagonist is dying and she loses her English and she can only communicate to her husband who doesn't speak Welsh in Welsh, and the daughter is translating. There's just a whole bunch of stuff going on. And the way he plays with it on the page, and all of the characters who are Welsh in the novel live on the English side of the border, and all of the English characters live on the Welsh side of the border. There's just a whole bunch of stuff going on. I think you'd have a field day.
Oh my God, I probably should have read that before I wrote this.
No.
Reading and be like, God, I could have done so many other things in the book.
I don't think so.
Sounds fascinating. Country Dance.
I want to discover almost everything for myself when I read it, but tell us just a little bit more about your 2 main characters.
So Oisín, firstly, is I'd say he's a flawed character. As I was writing him, it was exciting writing him. I'm not one of those writers who sit down and knows where anything is going at any point of time. I know lots of writers, they have the ending in sight at least. I don't have anything in sight. So I think I have to do it that way, because otherwise I think if I knew what was happening, I might not even do it. I feel like it's a sense of discovery for me as a writer of what's happening. So Oisín is flawed. He has certain trauma. So when he did speak Irish as a kid and his father dies when he's a child, and I won't say because that's one of the repressed memories of what happens later in the book, but it's a sudden shift for him when his father dies and language just floats away from him. So his mom, Bridget, at the time, obviously doesn't have much money, and she's trying to figure out, like, at that time, bring to a psychiatrist or a psychologist or something. And there's a part in the book that asks the psychologist to read what's on the page, and all he can see is the black and whites, and he feels that there's like a design in the black and whites, and there's something falling between the lines, but he can't make the letters connect. He can't make the words connect. And this is obviously all linked to trauma and memory and identity through the book. So he's flawed in many ways. We're very much inside his head a lot and how he sees the world. And obviously moving back from Brazil, he became quite successful, I suppose, in Brazil. He ends up working as a translator for companies, and, you know, he does well for himself, and he feels this new status as a gringo, and then suddenly becoming part of Brazil, and he finds an identity there. And Portuguese is actually really easy for him when he's in the book, and he discovered this new aspect to himself. And then moving back to Ireland, it's very much like he feels all of those shadows of the past and who he was, and he can't really understand how he could have been that person. Now he's this person, and then there's this disconnect with the mother. So it's really this kind of this search for who he is, I suppose. And also it's a lot about home and what makes a home and how we define home, and how Ireland again can be a home for him. And he feels like there's something about the place that he's living in. It's set in Crosshaven, which is where I grew up. So it's very much set in Cork, Crosshaven, Carrigaline, and Ambridge. Like, people will know these places. And it's like that Crosshaven kept something from him, and he feels that it's slowly giving it back to him. So this place and identity comes into it as well. And obviously then he's dealing with his own issues, but also his wife is Brazilian. She's just moved. They have a small child. They're trying to find a mortgage. There's all that kind of like the banalities of life in there. And he's worried constantly about everyone else and himself. So his narrative kind of really draws that way, but it draws a lot on the past. He has this idea that maybe he's seen as a failure by moving home. The act of moving home makes him a failure, you know, and he's not that person he once was. People are like, oh, is it autobiographical? You know, because obviously I lived in Brazil and I moved home, and it's not at all. It's done loads of research around it. Brazil obviously was a very important part of my life and an important part of his life, but that's where the parallels die. But then there's certain aspects of Bridget, for example, that I see myself in. There's certain aspects that other people would never ask, oh, is Bridget autobiographical? Do you know? But there's certain aspects of her, and she writes a letter. So she's very much in love with James, her boyfriend, and she gets pregnant, and she comes from a home. Her mother becomes an incredibly important person in her narrative and in Oisín's narrative. Kathleen is the grandmother, and I had so much fun writing her. I absolutely love Kathleen. I can still hear her in my head. Like, certain events would happen in my life, and it's her voice, like judging them almost in my head. So she becomes like Bridget's biggest confidant, and she's really to the point. She takes no shit. Bridget's always afraid sometimes to ask her things, because she knows if she asks, like, Kathleen's going to give it to her honestly, when she's going to have to be prepared for that. But she's a very wise woman and very practical in many ways. So I suppose for her, there's this identity of, obviously there's the revelation of being pregnant, and then speaking to James, and James's parents aren't like her parents. They would be very religious, and the religion becomes part of this, like in her being pregnant out of wedlock. And also what's that going to do to her relationship with James, and also what it's going to do with this future self that has now died. So she had this image of herself going to university, and she loves reading, and reading is a big thing in that household, and words are a big thing in that household. Kathleen is always coming out with these really brilliant, striking words. And Bridget, what do you mean? For God's sake, you don't know what that word means? Kathleen's you should know this. So she's grieving. I think that Bridget is actually grieving this other self that will never be, because now she's going to be a mom, and she's not going to do her leaving cert. She's not going to go to university. So her narrative really does play on that. She's pregnant in school in rural Cork in the early 80s. Like, she's at the soccer matches and everyone's looking at her and whispering and laughing. And so she has great resolution. She's very strong to stay who she is. So I admire her a lot. And there's a letter that she writes to James. Again, the whole idea is that language is so limiting. Like, even I wrote a book about it and I can't really explain what the book is. Like, language fails us all the time. And I suppose it fails all of the characters in different ways. And she writes a letter to James about being pregnant and just how she's feeling and the future. And it's when she's halfway through the pregnancy and she's feeling quite positive. And there's a lot in that letter that I think about the world. Like, that would be my viewpoint on certain things. You know, I don't think any writer is free from their characters. I think we bring ourselves into it in ways we're not even expecting to do. So Bridget's narrative kind of follows and does finish on her giving birth to Oisín. And she has a very difficult pregnancy and there's some drama towards the end. But yeah, basically the two narratives, Oisín does some stupid things in his. It's all about him fighting against who he was and trying to accept who he is and maybe trying to have that idea of this is the person I could be now.
Does Oisín have as good of hair as the author?
Is his hair mentioned? God, and thank you. I'm like literally, I feel like I'm going bald. I have this receding hairline. I was saying my Instagram is like, everything is like, how to not go bald. Here's a product for balding hair. Is his hair mentioned? I'm not great with it. It's definitely something I have to work on when I go back on books or even short stories, but especially novels. I might just leave a note being like, insert weather here or insert physical description here. Because they're not things that really excite me about my writing. I'm really like in the inside of the characters and I want to know how they're feeling at that space, at that time, at that moment. So there is lots of things like I'm hopefully finishing book 2. And there's 6 notes at the start being like, write seasons in chapter 6 and 4 and write physical descriptions of the characters. There are things that I will put in later and I'll get the bones of what I want to write down first.
That was a very rich and deep answer to a very flippant question. Thank you.
Thank you.
That is amazing.
I have a little glass of wine here helping me through.
I'm so jealous. It's not quite wine o'clock here at 10:30 in the morning.
It's a bank holiday Monday here, so I thought I had to have a glass of wine.
That is excellent. What are you working on now, Patrick?
So I'm working on another novel. It's very close to, I think I have another maybe 4 chapters left, but I know what's happening. So it is, again, it's not one narrator. I don't know if I'll ever be able to write a book that there's just one narrator. This one actually has 3, so it's following a family. It's following 3 siblings, actually. So Dave is the middle, and his chapters are in 2004. It deals with him. It's like a coming of age story. Again, it deals with identity. So it's about him. He's very musically talented, and his father goes missing, basically, or abandons them. It's unsure. And then in his chapters, the father is found in another country dead. So it's all about getting him back and dealing with that. And at that time, and he's really exploring his own sexuality, his identity, who he is. He feels attracted to both men and women. He can't really understand it. And everything is gay or straight in the chapters, which is based in 2004. And he can't really seem to fit into anything. And obviously his father, who left, had very serious issues of drinking and gambling and has lost all their money. So now they're in this kind of smaller home in a bad neighborhood. Again, it's set in Crosshaven. And then, so it deals with him. So the 3 siblings are himself, Cian, and Katie. And then Cian's chapters are 10 years later, then 2014. He's just become a dad for the first time. And he was like the sensible one. I suppose if he found it easier, instead of mourning or grieving or even questioning what he's going through, he became the father figure, helped his mother out. And I suppose the child, his baby, he actually doesn't even call baby by its name. It's just baby. He can't really connect. And I suppose it's like this flood of who he has become. Is that the person he wanted to become? And there's this kind of this maybe unraveling of self through his chapters. Cian has another 2 chapters. And then Katie's 10 years later, 2024. And she basically, in her chapter, they found out that their mom had cancer and is dying. In the meantime, Dave, the first narrator, he becomes quite famous. He's a famous Irish musician. So it's bringing all 3 siblings back together in those chapters and dealing with their past and dealing with their relationships. And like, I have 2 brothers and a sister. Like, me and my brother could have one relationship, and then when the next brother is in, that changes. And then when my sister is in, that changes. And it's how identities are, right? And how we are. So I suppose her chapters are quite interesting at the moment of figuring out that dynamic and them trying to become a family to deal with their mums, basically, impending death. Yeah.
That sounds amazing. Being overly bossy. Please hurry up. I want to read it.
I did say, so The Language of Remembering is released on the 25th of February. And my plan is to get draft 1 to my agent before this hits the shelves. So I can be like, at least she has the first draft and I can enjoy this process with this book and not worry then, because you read so much about book 2, like writers having issues getting book 2. I just don't want to even flirt with that idea or give myself, I'm just going to be really practical about it. Get a draft done and let's see if my agent thinks it's crap, then we'll have to rethink.
Well, your pub date, I believe, is February 25th.
Yes. Yeah.
And worldwide, it's coming out in Canada that day and America. So people around the world can get it. So that's awesome.
Yeah, it's coming out. So there'll be launches in Cork, Galway, Dublin, Belfast. We're so lucky here to have such a great literary scene of festivals. So it'll be at lots of festivals and stuff. So it's really starting to pick up pace now, like with events like this, with interviews and podcasts and stuff. So getting very real and getting very exciting. I've gone through so many, since signing a contract to getting it out there, getting endorsements, it's just been a kind of roller coaster. And now I'm telling myself just to be present and enjoy all of the moments instead of freaking out and spiraling and thinking everyone will hate it.
Please, I hope you really deeply enjoy it.
Good. Thank you.
Patrick and I talked offline about Cauvery Madhavan, a big friend of this channel, and her latest novel, The Inheritance, which Patrick has on his to-be-read pile, but it hasn't quite come to the top. Once you get to it, you're going to find some interesting things to do with one particular character whose narrative arc resonates quite deeply with the mother character in your novel. So you and Cauvery will have lots to talk about when you meet.
Right. Yeah, I listened to a podcast. There's a podcast here in Ireland called Burning Books by booksigner Ruth McKee. And I listened to her on that and she sounded brilliant. And I'm delighted to say that I'll be at a festival with her later in the year. So we'll actually get to meet in person, which would be fun. Yeah, it's great.
That is great. So now I think you have some books to recommend.
I do. I'm looking at them here. I'm thinking of the one I just finished in January, which is, I don't know if you've heard of this.
The title is Evenings and Weekends by Oisín McKenna.
Weekends. Have you read it?
No, I haven't.
Okay, so his name is Oisín, actually, Oisín McKenna. So he grew up in Ireland, lives in London. I just thought it was a really real novel. Like I really felt that it showed everything about contemporary living as we are now. The characters themselves were incredibly rich and incredibly complicated, and the facets and the nuances of identity and who they were spilled across the pages. And I suppose what I loved most about it is, again, there's certain things in it of being unable to do something, unable to show an emotion, unable to really say what you feel and the repercussions of that. And as a reader, we can see it happening. There's almost like this dramatic irony happening that we know what's happening and we can see it happening. We're like, Jesus, do the right thing, but it's so humane. And it all happens over a weekend in London and the characters are interlinked. So there's one character who is having a relationship problem with a boyfriend, an almost boyfriend, but she has another relationship. So it's like he's the third wheel almost, but then he's linked to the other main character. So they're all linked in different ways and going through different things. And I suppose it's not coming of age, but it's like that 30s. I suppose I'm 30, no, I'm 36. And it's that turning 30 and the idea of having the first child that is there. And then there's all the kind of forgotten mother figure of one of the characters. She has cancer and she's quite sick and she feels like she's just forgotten or feels like she's not really the main character in her own life. And it shows all these different relationships happening. And the opening line is about a whale, actually. A whale gets stuck in the Thames. And it's all about this whale being stuck and trying to be removed from somewhere they're not supposed to be. And I feel like that kind of resonates with a lot of the characters. A lot of them are in situations that they shouldn't be in, or they're stuck and trying to leave that situation. It was just really clever. The writing was on point. It was witty. It was funny. I felt for all of the characters and it wasn't sentimental in any way. And yet it had all of the feelings. So yeah, I thought it was absolutely brilliant. I really think it should be read by young adults, like people just out of school, read like curriculum books for young adults. I just think it would be a real reflection of what they are going through. So yeah, it was excellent. Evenings and Weekends. I think
I'm sold, even though I don't fit the demographic.
Yeah, no, but I think it's for, like, I've recommended it to loads of people. I think it won something at the Irish Book Awards last year, if I'm not mistaken. Okay. It was brilliant. And I just want to give a shout. I'm currently reading this, Roisin O'Donnell's Nest.
Oh, my book's coming across the pond to me. My copy.
Oh, fab. Yeah. So Roisin's amazing. So I know Roisin and she's a really lovely person. And I only started it like the other day and I've been being interrupted all the time. But it's very, like the plot, actually I wasn't expecting the plot is moving very quickly. The characters are really well drawn. I really feel, especially Kira, the main character, I feel her a lot already. And she has 2 daughters. So I suppose I can relate to like certain irritating things with the children. When something bigger is happening and that kind of in the child's life, that is that one tiny little thing about maybe a teddy bear or the other dinosaur is so important. And in the grand scheme of things, it doesn't make sense, but for them, it's so important. And then you have this huge moment for Kira, the actual narrator, who's leaving everything she knows behind, like you're running away from a relationship. So I'm really enjoying this at the moment. And then I absolutely loved this book.
The title is Though the Bodies Fall by Noel Oisín. I'm going to be reading that this year at some point too.
It is so good. Like the writing, I swear to God, the writing is unbelievable. So Noel Oisín, I would have met him. I wouldn't have known him very well. I met him at different events since I'd moved home. He's an absolute gentleman. He's one of the nicest people. And I read this, I think it might have been around lots of other big books at the time. There's huge Irish names. I think like Colin Barrett was out at the time, and the other one, Cala, which is amazing as well. Colin Walsh has Cala, which is brilliant. And this is, I think this is like just a slow, it just pulls you so slowly, so achingly into the story. And it's a story about a son who goes back to his parents' home when they pass and basically is very close to a cliff and people go to commit suicide there basically. And he is trying to save them. And there's this irony that he's saving these other people and he's not saving himself at all through it. I absolutely loved it. I think I bought at least 20 copies of this book to give as gifts to people because I just loved it so much. And the last one I'll say quickly.
And the title is Breakdown by Cathy Sweeney.
And just as Cathy Sweeney is an absolute legend.
Oh, I don't know that one.
She has a short story collection published with The Stinging Fly. I can't remember what it's called now. It's gone from the top of my head, but there's a story. And the opening line in one of the stories of the collection is something along, I'm probably butchering it, but it's something along the line. She loved her husband's cock so much, she brought her around in her lunchbox. And I was like, isn't that like one of the best opening lines of anything ever? This, like her stories were a bit more abstract, not really concrete. And this is very much a concrete story. Again, similar maybe to Nesting. It's basically about a breakdown of a woman, or maybe not breakdown, but the idea of a woman leaving what she knows behind. But she is the wittiest, funniest narrator. And Cathy Sweeney is a very witty, funny woman herself. And I actually read it last year. I was traveling for work and I think I started it in the taxi going to the airport. And by the time I had landed, I'd finished it and was like, just wanted to read it straight away again. It's a great kind of viewpoint on relationships, on female identity, motherhood, and being a wife. And then also she just has these great kind of outlooks on the world we're living in at the moment. And they're insightful and they're witty and they're fun. Yeah, so I have way more books here next to me. But they're the ones.
Those are great recommendations. Yes. And you sold them as well as you sold your own.
Okay, good.
Yeah,
Good.
Absolutely.
I sold mine a little better, though.
Definitely. We do have a few minutes left. You and I had very similar experiences. You moved back to Ireland from Brazil, and
yes,
including your library, and I moved back to Canada from Japan, and most of my library. That's not a private story. Please share it.
No, not at all. I was very lucky in Brazil. I did some events for the University of São Paulo and the Irish Embassy were involved. I actually met Mary O'Donnell, the Irish writer there, and we ended up becoming very good friends. And I also became really good friends with someone who worked in the embassy. So she's a very good friend of mine now. And we happened to be moving home around the same time. And she had a container. So she was like, just send me your stuff. I lived in Porto Alegre, she lived in São Paulo. So I sent a lot of my stuff to her and got it in her container. So I didn't have to spend extortionate amounts of money to get books home. But I did have to leave loads of books behind. But I ran a language school there and I had loads of amazing students. Like chose a a stack of books for each student, if that makes sense, and their
Oh, that's
personality.
lovely.
I think they'd love these, and I think books have two lives. They have the lives that's written within them and the lives of the actual physical book. So I always think, oh, it won't be nice in like 20 years if that student picks up the book and was like, oh, my old teacher.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And as I told you, put some in the container, but it was so expensive. Couldn't send very many that way. And then I mailed a whole bunch in boxes by the Japanese sea mail cheap rate, and they all
Good.
arrived here eventually. So,
Excellent. Amazing.
yes.
Yeah. They're so important to us, aren't they?
Oh my God. Patrick, I could talk to you all day, which means I'm really looking forward to reading The Language of Remembering and having you back for a longer chat about that.
Excellent. I'd love it. It would be an honor.
Thank you so much.
Great. Sean, thanks a million.
Oh my God, that book sounds like such a Sean book. I've already ordered it from the UK. I may have misspoken when I said it's being published in Canada and the US. It's going to be available in Canada and the US, but I think it's only published in the UK. Don't quote me on that either, but I just went to some major online booksellers' websites and they had it available, the same pub date as elsewhere, but it's only one publisher in the UK. You can order it online anywhere. And I've already pre-ordered mine just this morning. I can't wait to dive in. So I have been working on a book haul video. With my new software, the book haul videos take about as long as they always do. And I love doing and editing video book hauls where I get the quotes. The quotes that I can get off a Kindle preview, I just screenshot those. But some of them don't exist in that format. And so then I have to scan it or whatever. And then it comes up in a more colorful and more interesting font. That's all fussy work that I love doing, but I did about, 15 books or maybe 20 books. I can't remember. It did take a long time to get it edited and posted, but that went up this week, so do check that out. I have not finished any books. There's been a lot going on. Stay tuned for an update. I'm ready to check in on 2, and then I won't be starting anything new. Heaven forbid. No, Sean, no more new books for a long time, please. The books I told you I'd be starting last week, I'm ready to check in on. If you're taking part in my Patreon book club discussion of this book and don't want to hear my initial thoughts on the first 35 pages, you can fast forward using the timestamps below. But here are my preliminary thoughts on The Thorn Puller by Hiromi Ito, translated from the Japanese by Jeffrey Engels. This is so interesting, it sucked me in right away. It's set in Kumamoto, a smaller city on the south side of Japan. I've spent a week there with a friend, a former student, back before I moved to Japan. I loved it the best of all the cities I'd visited because it was small and sane. It wasn't so overcrowded that you couldn't move around without getting trammeled. And a very friendly small city. And that's where this novel is set. It's a first-person narrative about a Japanese woman sandwiched between elderly parents, an ailing husband, and young children. She lives in California, but goes back and forth quite often to Kumamoto City in Japan to take care of her mother. There is a lot in these first couple chapters about her mother who has problems with her legs and many doctor's visits. Turns out she's probably had a stroke, and the amount of care she needs is quite overwhelming, especially getting her poor mom to the toilet. Our protagonist has also brought her preteen daughter and enrolled her in school in Japan. The daughter's not so happy about how that's all working out. And her husband back in California has discovered that he has heart problems and is going to have surgery, and she's too busy looking after her mom to be with him while he's having surgery. There's a fascinating phone conversation where she makes him promise that he will never hold it against her that she didn't come back and be at his bedside during his surgery. The protagonist is not particularly likable, but she's fascinating. It's not quite like reading about a train wreck because she's very capable, but she speaks her mind, confiding to the reader, and she admits to some very not nice thoughts about all these people she's taking care of. It's not comedic. Maybe it is, but it's just, wow, I can't believe you said that out loud. And then I have to remind myself, no, you didn't. This is a first-person narration. But I'm enjoying it. I don't know what the title's about yet, The Thorn Puller, and I'm only that far into it. I'm intrigued at the end of this chapter, and I think it was the very first chapter, which is about 35 pages long. There is a note from the author, and I can't understand this. Maybe I will understand more about it when I read the translator's introduction or get more into the novel, but here's what the note from the author says, and I'll put it up on the screen. Some of the voices in this chapter come from Kenji Miyazawa's novel, Matasaburo the Wind Imp, the manga artist Naoki Yamamoto, the poet Sakutaro Hagiwara, the singer Momoe Yamaguchi, and the lyricist Yoko Aki. What does that mean? Some of the voices in this chapter. That is fascinating. Voices. She's inspired by certain lyrics or quotes or lines of dialogue, and she's threaded them in there. I guess that could be what it means, but I just find that really, oh my god, I need to know what that's all about. So, and I think I've heard of Kenji Miyazawa, but I hadn't heard of the manga artist, the singer, or the lyricist, so I might look those up at some point too. This is definitely starting out great. And I am 2 or maybe 3 chapters in to Meredith Hambrock's forthcoming second novel, She's a Lamb. It's coming out in early April, and I am reading an advanced reader copy so that I can interview Meredith in time to publish that video on her pub date. And I am sucked right into this one, too. And I've just made the connection that between this and the Thorn Puller, both women really speak their mind. That's interesting. I hadn't thought about that till just now. This is a young musical actor wannabe working as an usher. She sounds like a bit of a hot mess, which I think is Meredith Hambrock's trademark in terms of her protagonists. She dignifies her protagonists in a way that is very feminist and powerful, giving nuance, comedic and otherwise, to these protagonists in a way that makes you appreciate them and laugh with them rather than at them, if I can put it that way. Jessamine, she wants to be a star, and so where I'm at the end of chapter 2, I think it's chapter 2, is that she is auditioning for some local production of The Sound of Music, and she wants Maria's part. I know from the blurb, so this is not a spoiler, she doesn't get the part, and instead they offer her a position babysitting the actors playing the Von Trapp children. And she had a big disappointment, and I think she starts scheming to usurp the Maria character. I'm not sure, but it's going to be really funny, and I'm sure that I'm going to love Jessamine even more, but it's sure starting out good. I'm looking forward to chatting with Meredith about it once I finish. All right, I think that's all I've got. Thanks for watching.